We're going to look today at how to use the gridded response section of the North Carolina end of grade test for mathematics. And this is an example of the 6th grade answer sheet. If you notice, the first 18 questions are calculator inactive. That means you're not allowed to use a calculator. Of those 18 questions, the first 7 are multiple choice questions. After that, we get to the gridded response questions. That's questions 8 through 18 on the calculator inactive section. And that's the section I want to talk about today, and make sure that you know how to use those grids and know how to mark your answers properly. So gridded response answers can include whole numbers, they can include decimals, they can include improper fractions, they can include proper fractions, fractions that haven't been simplified, negative numbers, and empty boxes at the beginning or the end of your answer. What they cannot include is they cannot include mixed numbers. They can't include spaces between the numbers or symbols. They can't include any kind of bar notation, and they can't include any sort of unit. So when we look at that and how that's going to play out on a gridded response, what that's going to look like, what the grid actually looks like, that very top section up here, this section is where you're going to write your answer in. So you're going to use each box for one number or symbol. And then this next section is where you bubble in. If you've got a negative, which is only in this first box right here, and then the other, or first bubble right there rather, and then we have 4 different spots where you could put a backslash for a fraction, and we have 5 different spots where you could put a decimal in your answer. And then, of course, the whole bottom section is for bubbling in your numbers. So when we want to use the grid, the first thing we have to do is actually solve the problem, get what your answer is going to be. The second thing you do is you write your answer in the boxes without putting any spaces between the digits or symbols. Now, do you technically have to put your answer there? No, but it makes it a whole lot easier to go back and check and make sure that you've really put what you intended to put, check your bubbling, things like that. That's not the section that is actually checked when it goes through the machine. The bubbles are the part that's checked, but putting the numbers and symbols in the boxes helps you to make sure you've bubbled correctly. Then the third step is to write the decimal point, fraction bar, or negative sign in their own boxes if you need to use them. That's really part of the second step. It's just a reminder, though, that if you need a decimal point, a fraction bar, or a negative sign, they get their own box and therefore their own column in the grid. And then last but not least, be sure that you bubble accurately below your answer boxes, because that's the part that's truly going to be checked. So let's say that you get $23 for an answer. And if you get that, it can be gridded like anything that you see up here on the screen. Notice that it can be gridded all the way to the right. It can be gridded all the way to the left. It can be gridded somewhere in the middle, as long as the 2 and 3 are right next to each other, and as long as you bubble the 2 and the 3 correctly underneath of where you put them in the answer boxes. And we don't bubble in anything else in any of the other columns. So there's nothing we need to put there to show that there was nothing in those columns. So we make sure that if we leave an answer box empty, that whole column is empty. We don't bubble anything in there. Notice that there's also no way to include that dollar symbol as a unit. You're not going to include any units in your answers when you're bubbling on the gridded response section. All right, if you get an answer, let's say you get an answer of 15 1/4 inches to a problem. Your answer could be gridded like either of these 2 examples. You could grid 15.25 because you can change it to a decimal. That's fine to do. And notice the decimal got its own box, and we bubbled underneath. We bubbled the 1 and the 5 and the decimal and the 2 and then the 5. You could also change it to an improper fraction, 61/4. And again, notice you cannot grid a mixed number. It has to be changed to an improper fraction or to a decimal. So we cannot put a 15 and then leave a space and then put a 1/4. Because if we did, it's going to get marked wrong because of the space between the 15 and the 1/4. If you get a fraction for an answer, such as 3/4, you can use any equivalent fraction or an equivalent decimal. So we could do the 3/4 as we got. We could do it as 0.75, and we don't need that leading 0. We could just do 0.75 if we wanted. We could also do 6/8, which is an equivalent fraction. And that brings up the point that if you work out a problem and you know the answer is not in lowest terms, you don't necessarily have to simplify it, because it's going to get graded correct even if it's not simplified, as long as you have the correct answer. And then if we get a decimal answer that's not going to fit in the grid because it has more than, it's going to have more than 6 digits in the decimal and such, then you can either round it to that last place that will fit, or you can put just as much as what's going to fit. But if you do that, you have to fill, whether you round it or you just put what's going to fit, you have to fill the entire grid. So if you, and the other option is if you know what the fraction equivalent is, you could just change it to a fraction. Then you wouldn't necessarily have to fill in the whole grid. For example, let's say we do this and we get 0.4166666666, so forth and so on. This is obviously one where you're going to have bar notation. Then where you would have bar notation, but we can't do that on our grid, so we could grid it any of the ways that it's showing here. We could put the 0 in front as a leading 0. That's fine in the ones place. We don't have to, but we could. Notice in the first example that I did here, I rounded off because this really would be 0.41666, so forth and so on. But this 6 right here tells the 6 in front of it to round up to a 7. So that's why I rounded it to 0.4167. I wouldn't have to round it. I could have left it as 6. That would have also been okay. And I don't need the leading 0, so I could have had 0.41666 if I didn't round it, and then if I did round it, it would be 0.41667. It just so happens that that repeating decimal equals 5/12, and if I knew that, I could put 5/12 the fraction. So let's take a look at a couple of things. Here's an example of a number that is gridded correctly, and then that same number gridded incorrectly. So -13, the way we did it on the left, that is correct. The one on the right is not correct, because if you notice, the negative symbol is written here, and yes, they gridded it over here, but the problem with that is that that's not directly below where we put the negative in our answer boxes. And also, if you look at our bubbling, these 3 columns right here would be completely empty if we bubbled that negative over there on the left to show that we meant a negative. And remember, you can't have any spaces when you bubble, so that's why that one's bubbled incorrectly. The next one, 17,000. Again, notice we can't have any spaces. So if we try to put a comma in there, there's no comma that we can bubble in. So that's going to leave an empty space in our bubbling. Therefore, it's going to be wrong. Another example, 3 5/10, 7/2. Those are both correct. What we cannot do is do it as a mixed number, because I have the 3 there and I have the 1/2 with a space between them. It's not going to read that because of the space. Now, sometimes people will say, well, then instead of putting the 3 here, can I put it in this box and make it 3 1/2? No, you can't do that, because then it's going to be read as 31/2. So you couldn't do that either. So we have covered pretty much everything that you're going to see as far as answers that you would need to put in on your gridded response, and hopefully that clears up how you put your answers so that you can put everything exactly as you intend to put it.